Hey everybody. So my dash mount fell off. What I want to talk about, I saw this meme that I think was well intended, but it said reasons for abuse, and it was a little pie chart, and I put this in the Facebook group, a little pie chart, and it says abuse or the reasons your partner abuses you or something like that, and the pie chart's just all one color, and it's basically it's a choice, right? Abuse is a choice, and that was the entire point of this meme. And as much as I want to agree with it, as I want to, I don't agree with it. I can't agree with that. And that's because it's such a complex issue that you just can't simplify it down to something like that, where they abuse you because they choose to abuse you, and that's it. Like, no, there's way more to it than that. Because first of all, abuse is an irrational behavior. Behavior itself is usually irrational. Emotions are irrational, right? And abuse is an irrational behavior. Why would you choose to harm people that have your best interest in mind? It's an irrational behavior. So to say that it's a choice implies that it's rational, and it's not. It isn't. So if it's not a choice, then what is it? And I've got a playlist on the the neuroscience of abuse. And it's been a few years since I've broached the subject, but if you're curious about the neuroscience behind it, go check out that playlist. As you imagine, it's a playlist. Got 5-6 videos on there, I think. So it's a pretty in-depth topic. But what I want to emphasize and focus on, in the abuse cycle, okay, you've got different phases, right? You've got basically the love bombing, the idealization. Hey, I found my unicorn, right? And so you're the perfect idealized mate who idealizes a narcissist or somebody else who's disordered, like a borderline, right? You go through that idealization phase, and then they start noticing that maybe you're not as perfect as they thought, and they largely just keep quiet, but effectively the buzz wears off, okay? And it's usually there's usually an identifiable event that killed the love bombing, unicorn, honeymoon phase, right? Everything's up here, and then it's usually an event, right? And they're like, whoa, why would you do that? That was unexpected, right? And so from that point on, poof, it's come down some, and they're never able to get back to that love bombing like they wanted. And then throughout the phases of the abuse cycle, there's the construction phase where they're trying to fix the little minor things wrong with you. And then when that doesn't work, then they start devaluing you and downing you. And then the cycle just continues, and it just grows and grows and grows in size, right? But, that's the abuse cycle. Now, to say it's a choice, that doesn't really sound like a choice. That is a cycle. If it was a choice, there would not be a cycle. So think about that, right? Well, if it's not a choice, well, then why do they do it? It's not a choice that they're making. In fact, you'll hear them say things like, why do you make me do these things? Why would you do that? They'll say something like, you leave me no choice, or I will be forced to do blah, right? So they firmly believe that there is no choice to be had, and they believe this because of their previous experiences that they've had in life with abusive people they fully believe that they know what's coming at the end of it, right? And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy and cycle for them, because what lies at the core of narcissistic personality disorder, and I've talked about this before, there's a borderline core beneath narcissism, right? And in that borderline core is this very, very permeating, pervasive sense of self-inadequacy. And there's other things that go along with that, because you feel very inadequate, right? Like a loser kind of person. And so there's sort of this instinctual understanding that once people realize that you're not such a good person, that they're ultimately going to abandon you. So there's an intense fear of abandonment that comes in on top of that. But more times than not, you will hear somebody who's abusive saying, "You leave me no choice," right? So abuse isn't a choice, in my opinion, at least. It's not a rational choice they make. So what is it? It's a belief system response, right? Their beliefs. They believe that something is afoot. You know, it's what they think is going to happen, and they're now acting preemptively. So another way to, now that I've had talked about all those things, take two. Now that we've discussed all that, I want to sort of break down how the structure of the disorder feeds the cycle, so you can kind of understand it. And again, this is just my opinion that I've formed over years of reading about this stuff. It may not be completely correct, but it's got some truth. It's got a lot of truth to it, I think. So if you think about, in the sense that if narcissism has borderline at its core, and borderlines have that fear of self-inadequacy, borderlines do not have a built-in defense mechanism to defend against those feelings of inadequacy. So if you're somebody who was maybe an overweight child and was teased and bullied as a kid for being overweight, and then you grew up, you got fit, you got in shape, and then you weren't overweight, but now you're just built like a normal person, you're still going to be sensitive to fat jokes, because you're going to go back to that place in time where you were abused. Well, narcissism is a defense against that by becoming, the healthy, fit, strong, buff, like gorgeous body kind of person, so that nobody in their right mind could ever think you were fat or unattractive or any of those things. Narcissism is a defensive mechanism against that, and it is very, very fragile. It is very fragile, right? And it's propped up by ego. Now think about this. If the idealization phase is typically kicked off by an event that you can put your finger on and say, this was the moment things changed. And if you're watching this video, chances are good you know exactly what I'm talking about. This was the moment shit changed, right? That moment, more than likely, was the first time that something happened that got past their narcissistic defense, and they got hit with that self-inadequacy. They got kicked in the ego. That's why their ego is so sensitive, because without the narcissistic mask and all of the things that they've built up around them, they have no defense against that, right? So the first time something gets through that narcissistic defense, it's very painful. You have to understand, borderlines and narcissists, it's very, very painful when that inadequacy feeling gets hit. It is very, very painful, and it can put them into a complete psychological collapse. So there's that, right? Now, think about this for a second. This is what I think is at the core of narcissistic abuse, at least one of the main reasons why. This is sort of how I imagine it. unconsciously in their heads. The defensive barrier that they built around themselves got breached. And they're like, whoa, well, that doesn't usually happen. I don't want that to happen again, because it's really, really painful when it does. And, oh, fuck, it happened again. Ow, that hurt. Ow, fuck. Ow, fuck again, right? So, for them, if they're experiencing an intense psychological pain due to their inadequate defensive structures, they're going to, through the whole construction phase where you become a construction project where they're trying to fix these things about you, what they're trying to do is prevent themselves from getting hurt. But they don't have a way of doing that very well, if at all, right? So no matter what they do, they can't really defend against it. And if you're the closest person to them in their life, so because of proximity, you begin to bring the things into their life that are hurting them, because they don't control you. They can control themselves, and they have the most control over themselves, but they're in close proximity to somebody else of whom they have no control. So they can't control when, where, and how they're exposed to these painful experiences. So they start trying to just sort of delicately work on you and delicately fix this and fix that. And then maybe not so delicately. And then before long, they're like, ow, stop hurting me, you're hurting me. And they get to a point where, like, if you don't stop hurting me, I'm going to have to start hurting you. And that's, I think that's the experience in their heads, perhaps maybe in not so many words. And if you happen to be watching, and if you happen to be diagnosed with narcissistic or borderline disorders, feel free to sound off in the comments and tell me if I'm way off. Because if I'm way off, I'm sure as hell deleting this video. But I think there is something to it. I don't think abuse is a rational choice. It's not a choice. It's not a decision. You can't say something like, abusers abuse because they choose. Abuse is always a choice. No, what you're doing is you're nerfing up your world. You're nerfing the world for yourself so that you don't have to think about anything else that's painful. And that's a bad habit to have, especially if you're here because you believe you've been abused by somebody that has a disorder. It does you no good to turn around and nerf your world and tell yourself that it's all just a choice that they made and that you weren't complicit in it. You were complicit, but you were not making choices. So it goes two ways, right? They see you as abusive, right? And you're like, I'm not abusive, you're abusive. Well, both of you see each other as abusive. So if abuse is a choice and you've got two people perceiving each other as abusive, and both of you are saying you're not choosing to be abusive, then that should tell you that it's not a choice. It's an interaction. And same as anything else, an interaction is complex. It is complicated. And personally, I think what I think is abuse comes down to defending against pain when other nicer defenses have failed. And this is true of neurotypical people and disordered, right? I mean, you don't have to have a disorder to be a dick. You can just be a dick. Now, and I think that's where people get confused, because you can make the choice to be a dick, right? That's easy. But abuse is far more complicated. You don't choose to just be abusive, right? You don't choose that. It's a response. It's an interaction. Blah blah blah. I think I'm gonna just start repeating myself from here on out. Hey, look, if you like this video, check me out on Facebook. There's a Facebook group, the Narcissistectomy group. I pronounce it Narcissectomy because it's easier. It's spelled the same as this channel. Send a request. Come join us. We've got like maybe a dozen people in there so far, so it'll be fun. Good place to engage, ask questions, and talk, that kind of stuff. I'll put a link in the description. If I forget, just put a comment that says, hey, dummy, you forgot to put the link to your group, like you always do, because I do. So just remind me to put the link in there. I'll drop the link in, and then come join us. It'll be a party. Please like, comment, or share. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next video.